So the next speaker is David Feldman from University of California, Irvine.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Feldman with the University of California. I want to thank all of you for the privilege and the pleasure of being able to speak to you this afternoon, especially Mira, for inviting me to this conference. This is the third time I've been in Israel, the first time I've been to the Dead Sea. As a political scientist who studies water and resource issues, I love to study water conflicts, and living in California, I don't have to go very far to study them. But I got tired of studying California water conflicts, so I decided to visit Israel a third time to look at the Dead Sea. But in all seriousness, I want to talk about the life and death of inland seas as a global policy challenge. And I want to begin with perhaps an obvious point for all of us gathered here today. We're all concerned about inland seas, certainly one of them, the one in front of you, the one behind me, the Dead Sea. But we're in fact concerned, or ought to be concerned, about all of the world's inland seas, because each and every one of them is deeply threatened, not only by global environmental change, but by other anthropocentric activities that are depleting and destroying these seas before our eyes. Why concerned? Well, they're naturally saline, productive water bodies, as we've seen today and as we're going to see over the next 2 days, that support valued and threatened ecosystems, such as migratory birds, that nurture local economies that have been traditionally dependent on agriculture and fisheries. They serve as important cultural, historical, and recreational amenities. This is a common factor worldwide for these inland seas. But despite their unique settings and circumstances, at least within the social sciences, we have found a number of ways in which their demise is very much common or deducible by some common factors. They may generate irreversible ecological damage if certain activities are not reversed. They can cause local economic and political dislocation and conflict. We see this worldwide. We're seeing it here in the Dead Sea region. And it engages non-governmental groups as well as nation states in restoration efforts, which also forces these groups and nations to collaborate in ways that they've not always been comfortable in doing, but have to do if they're going to restore these efforts. So how is this a public policy challenge? Well, the causes and consequences of the demise really have three common factors, and pardon the alliteration, but I think it fits. Diversion, transferring water to agriculture, which increases salinity, decreases farm yields, reduces biodiversity, and impacts health and well-being. And depletion, the diminishing volumes of these inland seas without replenishment, is an environmental justice issue, not only an issue for natural resources, but for the populations living in those regions, particularly those that are already in underrepresented groups. And it can damage the ecology and health in neighboring communities. And degradation, reducing the healthy functioning, impacts local culture and economies, leaving states and civil societies with the burden of restoration. One of the things that concerns us most of all is that these problems may be irreversible. We may have reached a tipping point, which is to say, even if we ceased problem-causing activities, certain conditions will not fully restore themselves over time, but this may be the new normal. I want to look in particular at two case studies, the Dead Sea and the Salton Sea in California, which I'm familiar with. And also I want to add a couple of observations regarding Lake Urmia in Iran and the ROC in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan in terms of amplifying some of the common lessons and denominators that we see. Very briefly, the Salton Sea is California's largest lake. It provides critical habitat for over 400 species of migratory birds, including many endangered species that are listed under our Endangered Species Act in the USA. Farming and water transfers to cities, including San Diego, and as well as climate change, are shrinking the lake, contaminating return flow, threatening the habitat, increasing salinity, and as the lake desiccates, degrading air quality. I want to direct your attention to the photograph on the right, obviously a remote photograph from space. You'll notice just to the bottom of the Salton Sea is this intensively irrigated area known as the Imperial Valley. Fully 40% of the winter vegetables marketed in the United States originate in this valley. And as you can tell by this intensively cultivated area, and notice the boundary between the United States and Mexico, the dramatic differentiation in water use and cultivation. This is return flows from the Imperial Valley used to replenish the Salton Sea. Now with the demise of farming, the water rights are being sold to San Diego and to cities such as Palm Springs, which is actually depleting the Salton Sea even more. I don't have to spend a lot of time, this has already been reviewed today, but the Dead Sea has some remarkable similarities, damming and upstream diversion. You've heard about the national water carrier, and those of you living in Israel know fully well that it is diverting water from the upstream Jordan. But also the diversion of the Yarmouk in Syria has cut inflow. So this is obviously a multinational problem. Mineral extraction. Israel Chemicals, for example, has added to desiccation. Climate change has decreased flow, increased regional temperatures, and reduced rainfall. And even the sea aquifer, some 1,000 meters below sea level, may be depleted in 50 years. So this is obviously not simply a surface water threat, but a groundwater threat as well. I want to talk a little bit about some comparative policy challenges, and there are some things that are really strikingly similar. We've already know about the great cultural aspects of the Dead Sea, but likewise the Salton Sea, it's true. Lake Cahuilla, an ancient freshwater body, the forerunner of the Salton Sea, was thought to be connected to the culture that lived there, the Cahuilla Indians, thought to be connected to the great Aztec culture of Mexico by language. So again, and many of their ancestors live in this region today, their progeny. Economic issues are paramount. Mineral extraction in terms of the Dead Sea, and leaving behind substances that are mined. In the case of economics in the Salton Sea, the Imperial Valley and farming and eutrophication and low oxygen levels, as well as high salinity that is damaging the usefulness of water for agriculture, but is also providing less inflow, which is leading to bird kills as well as fish kills in the Salton Sea. Most importantly, I think, is the issue of environmental justice, and I alluded to this before. When we talk about the depletion and the degradation of inland seas, we're not only talking about natural resources, but we're talking about groups, particularly underrepresented populations, who are ordinarily powerless and having much influence over the politics of either degradation or restoration. In the case of the Dead Sea, residents in Ein Gedi, for example, have turned into activists demanding assistance as they watch the land crumble around them. Clive Lipchin, a good friend and colleague of mine, who's the director of the Transboundary Water Management Center at the Rava Institute, has noticed that many people in that particular community and surrounding communities feel that their government has abandoned them. This is very similar to what we find in California. Salton Sea is located in Imperial County, which is without question the lowest per capita county in annual income in California, has the highest unemployment rate and the highest rates of childhood asthma, definitely due attributable to the desiccation of the Salton Sea region and all of the dust exacerbating lung ailments and other respiratory ailments. Environmental degradation, very simply, in the case of the Dead Sea, the retreating tree is left behind infertile saline lands. We've heard earlier today about the problem of instability and collapsing of land into craters, threatening the built environment. Likewise, we have a similar situation in the Salton Sea. The transfer of water to urban areas under something called the Quantification Agreement about 15 years ago, which will expose additional square miles of the lake to dryness and more dust containing silicates, toxic and caustic salts, and heavy metals. It's interesting, too, when you look at the parallels of mitigation costs. In the case of the Red Sea, Dead Sea Diversion project, and I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment, about a $10 billion estimate in cost. Likewise, about $10 billion to restore the Salton Sea through a comparable diversion project, in this case from the Sea of Cortez, south in Mexico, into the Salton Sea. Without mitigation, the damages are estimated to cost some 3 times that amount. California has appropriated a nominal sum towards some initial restoration, and not surprisingly, given current conditions in the United States in terms of national environmental policy, the federal government has committed a fraction of what the state of California has agreed to contribute. What will happen without restoration? Well, again, we can see some parallels. You can read through these yourself. But economic impacts are likely to be paramount, and economic impacts will be severe in both regions, and a lot of uncertainty. How will it affect farms in the case of the Salton Sea area, aesthetic value, recreational values, and of course in the Dead Sea we're also seeing similar things. Mineral industries, while they may increase in efficiency, infrastructure damage may counterbalance the benefits to them. Ecological impacts, also very similar. Impacts to threatened and endangered species in both the Salton Sea and threatening resources in the Dead Sea. Very, very similar and important impacts. The lowering of groundwater, the rising salinity, the reduction in biodiversity. When you read the various research accounts of the impacts environmentally to the depletion of both of these inland seas, we see tremendous parallels. And health and miscellaneous related issues. Fine particulates in the air quality of the Salton Sea region and the likely health impacts that will come from that, very pronounced. And again, in the case of the Dead Sea, mostly what we hear about is the altering of the shoreline, destabilizing infrastructure, damaging buildings, roads, agriculture, preventing tourist access, and so forth. And when you look at these 2 projections on the bottom pictures, what's interesting is that without restoration, over time, a similar decline in the levels of both of these inland seas is likely to be seen, very pronounced. We've heard 1 meter a year in the case of the Dead Sea, quite comparable in terms of the Salton Sea, roughly 1 meter a year. Very briefly, comparative governance. We're looking at 2 different countries, but nevertheless, lots and lots of agencies are involved in managing these inland seas. That's true throughout the world. And fragmentation among these various authorities is both significant in terms of sometimes impeding a single collaborative effort that will be required to undertake a conscientious program of restoration. On the other hand, and being fair, that fragmentation is understandable given the fact that different resource agencies are usually empowered to govern and oversee only one set of resources. They'd be biological resources, hydrology, etc. And what we have seen in both cases is that as efforts towards some restoration has taken place, a greater degree of coordination among these agencies has also taken place. So that's an optimistic trend. Diversion is salvation. Many of you are familiar with the proposed Red Sea, Dead Sea Canal and desalination project. These are two different archetypes of what that might look like. The basic differences, as you can see for yourself, is that on the left, which is a more recent version of what has been proposed by both Israel and Jordan, two desalination plants rather than one, but still a pumping system, and freshwater supply for Amman. Very significant. That's something that is very much a part of this project, with brine being sent to the Dead Sea. Similar situation in the Salton Sea. These are three engineering plans. These are actually bids that have been made to what is called the Salton Sea Authority in California to move water from the Sea of Cortez here, or Gulf of California as we call it in the States, up to the Salton Sea. Different configurations, and you'll notice, exclusive of desalination facilities, the wide-ranging estimate of costs from 1.7 to some $4.1 billion. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the engineering, but what I do want to spend time on is the politics of this. If it were simply a matter of sticking a pipe somewhere and pumping water into a basin, the problem probably would have been solved in both inland seas by now. But it's a much deeper problem than that. And that's why I use this phrase, pipelines or pipe dreams. International cooperation is central to both, and it's a formidable set of obstacles in each one. In the case of the Dead Sea, many of you know this, the impacts of the Dead Sea's demise are felt in Israel, Palestine, Jordan, manifest in concern over water supply, ecology, infrastructure, and tourism. The Red Sea, Dead Sea Canal project is currently in stalled negotiations over a revised Jordan-Israel peace treaty that was initially conferred in 1994. Initially, this was all seen as an effort to reduce water shortages as well as bilateral tensions. On balance, all three countries contend that restoration is urgent. One Jordanian official said that the area's religious, political, and historical significance leaves little time to waste. In the case of the Salton Sea, the impacts of the Salton Sea's demise are also felt in the U.S. and Mexico. Air pollution from the latter exacerbates the air quality in the Salton Sea region, while dust from the former affects the health of people living in Mexicali, Mexico. The diversion project that's been proposed between the Salton Sea and the Sea of Cortez, however, could impact a biosphere reserve in Mexico. And no formal discussions have actually been enjoined between the United States and Mexico on what to do about this. As you can see here, most recently, the two leaders of Israel and Jordan shaking hands on an agreement, but the agreement is very much up in the air. Very quickly, I mentioned that there are other cases in which some of these lessons can be seen. I won't spend a lot of time on Lake Urmia, other than to say that there has been tremendous problems and very little progress made over time. What is interesting is that from an environmental justice standpoint, what progress has been made in the case of Urmia has largely been fomented by women's groups in the regions who have been most sensitive to the health and economic issues on their families. And this could be perhaps a very practical example of ecofeminism, which we don't often see. But again, environmental justice, paramount. RLC, many of you know all about the RLC and its degradation and only partial restoration in the northern segment, a fraction of what it used to be. Very quickly, this slide, when you're at a point where health is impacted severely, even a little bit of restoration perhaps can make people feel very good about themselves. I guess this says something about having low expectations and high results. So in conclusion, why do we degrade inland seas? We know better, or we should. Let me suggest that changing societal needs and values influence how we view them. It's a kind of path-dependent policy. We engage in certain activities that become so paramount to our way of life that positive feedback between our perceptions and our management and our physical and biological conditions will vary depending on a society's phase and development. In these regions, all four of these inland seas and others, initial settlement, the goals of populations around these areas was to exploit and use, with very localized withdrawal and diversion. As industrialization set in, mining and large-scale agriculture changed the range of human activities in these regions to where the goals became not merely exploiting, but harnessing and controlling via dams and large-scale diversion and siphoning. And now we're in a post-industrial age, where the goals are to restore and renew natural systems via very complex reclamation projects, but not coincidentally that are being promoted by social movements in the countries affected dramatically by these seas. Does this suggest a changing agenda for inland seas? Well, possibly. While post-industrialism encourages people to seek natural amenities and to again view inland seas as recreational assets, as aesthetic and historically valuable assets, as community development assets, and as we've seen, even as social justice access, restoration is not without its challenges. And since I teach in the School of Social Ecology, I'm very, very concerned, as are my colleagues, with how the decline and disappearance of inland seas is really a complex political conundrum that we're going to be enduring for quite some time. The restoration costs are high. How to pay remains uncertain. Large-scale economic activities have historically taken precedence over the health of underrepresented groups. Cultural and ecological values tend to be underappreciated until the degradation reaches a point of severity. The authority for restoration is often fragmented. There are few precedents for inclusively incorporating affected groups in decisions to restore. And while international collaboration is needed, identifying a unifying international interest is often difficult and elusive. So solutions require multidisciplinary understanding of all of these assets, and hopefully that's where we're beginning to be with the Dead Sea, the Salton Sea, and these other inland seas. I thank you very much.
Maybe time for one short question.
So Upton Sinclair once wrote that trying to get people to understand something is impossible if their salaries depend on not understanding it. And so I'm doing a very similar, not similar, but I'm working on a project with the groundwater and the seawater intrusion in California. And I'm having a great deal of difficulty trying to convince people that the seawater intrusion could be advantageous if we see it as a way to do marine aquaculture on shore.
Right.
And because I talk to people who are in the water business, all they care about is trying to push the seawater offshore. So I'm just curious, because you're nodding your head profusely, but I mean, how do you get around these problems? The social elements are impenetrable. And it just seems like you can't get people to understand these new aspects of things until it's too late.
It's a great question, and it is something that I've scratched my head about, my colleagues as well. And in California, we see it, in fact, throughout the western United States, as you know. And it comes down to this notion of path dependency. Oftentimes, when you talk to people in government, water agencies, and you say, why are you doing that? And why don't you change? And why don't you realize why evidence-based, science-based decision-making should guide what you do? And oftentimes the answer you'll get is, well, we've never done it that way before, or we've always done it this way. So how do you change it? And I'm not exactly certain. It's something that we continue to grapple with. But I think it starts with recognizing something that is very difficult for decision makers to understand. It's not difficult for my students to understand, but it seems to be difficult for people in high political places to understand. And that is that we can't continue to do the things we do without eventually having to pay the consequences. And one of the things that we, I think, plea for, both you and I in our businesses, is something called adaptive management, which is concede that you've made mistakes. You can't fix them, but you can take the lessons of those mistakes and say, from this point forward, we know what not to do in the future. That's where I think it starts. It's adaptive management, and it's something that the water management community, at least in the U.S., and I think in many other parts of the world in my studies, don't quite fathom. But I think that's the key.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So let us proceed to the next talk.